Support for I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere comes from MX Publishing, with the largest catalog of new Sherlock Holmes books in the world. New novels, biographies, graphic novels, and short story collections about Sherlock Holmes. Find them at mxpublishing.com.
And by the Wessex Press, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at wessexpress.com.
And from listeners like you, who support us through Patreon. Bonus material, thank you gifts, and more await at patreon.com/ihearofsherlock. I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 281, The Lantern's Dance.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became astronomer.
In a world where it's always 1895, it's I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we interview authors, editors, creators, and other prominent Sherlockians on various aspects of the great detective in popular culture.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Bert Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
Hello and welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
And Bert, have you got your lantern lit?
My lantern
Are you lit?
The smoking lamp is not lit because no one smokes anymore except Ed Pettit.
A smoking lantern.
So we don't have that lit anymore, but I do have the next best thing. I do have my penlight flashlight.
Well, you can light the way to this episode, which is going to be a fun one. We have Laurie R. King back with us. This is Laurie's first time with us by herself. She has bravely taken the step to join us and speak about her creation, Mary Russell and Sherlock Holmes. So it's going to be illuminating and fun, and we will look forward to chatting with her about her latest book in the series. Just show notes are available at ihearofsherlock.com, as well as in the podcast app you happen to be using. We've got links to various things we're going to be talking about, including items in the news. That'll be after the interview. And a link to our Patreon page where you can support us for as little as $1 a month. And that goes to keeping the lights on here. And it also gives all of our Patreon supporters the ability to listen to the show without ads. An added benefit, I would say. And we also would like to remind you that we have a quiz in this episode, as we do in every episode. It's available after the interview, so you want to stay tuned for that. We give you 2 lines of poetry, and we ask you to guess which Sherlock Holmes story we're talking about. We've had a lot of participation recently, and I don't think they're terribly difficult to figure out, so there's an opportunity for everyone to participate and potentially win a prize. Before we get to the interview, a couple of items of note from our listeners. The first one came in an email to us from our friend Sean Farrell. From our friend Sean Wright. You remember we were talking about fezzes in the last episode, Bert?
Oh, yes.
And we even used an image of Edward Hardwicke as Dr. Watson putting on his fez before lighting up a cigar. What Sean had something to tell us about smoking caps and fezzes and whatnot.
Well, he pointed out that our late friend John Farrell was the proud owner and wearer of quite an elaborate embroidered smoking cap, and that the smoking cap, well, he told us, first of all, the difference between the fez and the smoking cap, which I'm sure all of our sartorially informed listeners already know, so it doesn't bear repeating, of course. It's just insulting to repeat that. But, and then told us, pointed to a couple of instances in the canon where the smoking cap seems to have appeared.
Yeah, it looks like it was in The Dying Detective. It's a low and circular cap that was worn by Culverton Smith. If you look at the illustrations for The Dying Detective, that should be apparent. So, looks like we should be focusing ourselves on smoking caps, not on fezzes. But Sean goes on to to tell us we are both a wealth of information and hilarity.
Oh, really?
Such a pleasure to listen to the two of you having fun with the canon. Well, we try. And then regarding the Gillette lunch, which we reported on in the last episode, we weren't at the event, so we were kind of flying blindly there. But Shayna Carter wrote in to give us some details about what happened at the Gillette lunch. Ray Betzner made the announcement that Francine Kitts was the recipient of the Susan Rice Mentorship Award. This is an annual award that's given to a Sherlockian who encourages and welcomes people into the fold of Sherlockiana. And Francine Kitts is the recipient from this year. And there was a skit that was performed by the 3 student players. And this was with Curtis Armstrong as Sherlock Holmes, Ashley Polasek as a hilariously jaded Mrs. Hudson, Ken Ludwig as the narrator and Holmes's bust, and Ray Betzner in a silent role as Colonel Moran. And that was followed by the Friends of Bogies of Baker Street, who presented their annual play, Sherlock Holmes. And in this instance, he was combined with the James Bond universe. We had Paul Singleton as Holmes, Sarah Montague as Mrs. Moneypenny, Andrew Jaffe as Q, and Lee Shackelford as Blofeld. So that explains why you had a large bald man stroking what looked like a stuffed rabbit in some photos from that. So always fun. Laurie R. King is the award-winning best-selling author of a new series featuring San Francisco Police Department cold case inspector Raquel Lang, the contemporary Kate Martinelli series, the historical Stuyvesant and Gray stories, 5 acclaimed standalone novels, and 18 books in the Mary Russell Mysteries series. Together with Les Klinger, Laurie has edited The Grand Game Volumes 1 and 2, as well as A Study in Sherlock, The Echoes of Sherlock Holmes, In League with Sherlock Holmes, and In the Company of Sherlock Holmes. Laurie is the recipient of 2 Anthony Awards, a Nero, a McCavity, a Lambda, an Edgar, and was named the Grand Master by the Mystery Writers of America in 2022. Laurie received her investiture, the Red Circle, in the Baker Street Irregulars in 2010. She lives in Northern California, where she's at work on the next Mary Russell mystery. Laurie King, welcome back to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Oh, thank you.
It's so nice to have you here on your own this time. The training wheels are off, so to speak.
So, are you referring to Les Klinger as my training wheels?
Yeah, well, whose training wheels isn't Les, really? Always nice to have him as a sidecar, right?
Oh, yeah.
Well, the last time you were here, way back on episode 105, you were talking about Echoes of Sherlock Holmes, which is a book that you and Les edited together.
Yeah.
But I think what we're most interested here is talking with you about the Mary Russell series. But in order to do that, I think we want to go back even further with you and understand where you first met Sherlock Holmes.
Is there anything before Mary Russell? Well, I'm one of those who basically discovered Holmes as an adult. I'm sure that everybody reads The Speckled Band and Hound of the Baskervilles when they're in high school. Aren't those sort of the basic ones? But I started playing with the idea of what would that extraordinary mind look like in a different setting. And instead of Holmes being a Victorian male, what would that mind look like if it were housed in a young female 20th century person instead? And that's where Mary Russell came from. I started writing the idea of when would we meet her? When would she meet him? And I thought, well, the best time would be when when Sir Arthur is finished with him. So at the beginning of the Great War, which is the last of the settings of the Conan Doyle stories, young Mary Russell is wandering across the Sussex Downs and nearly steps on Sherlock Holmes, who is, watching bees, because what else does a beekeeper do? And I started writing. I was 15 when I first met Sherlock Holmes, is the first line in the book, and realized that I knew next to nothing about Sherlock Holmes. So, which was kind of a problem if he was going to be a character in the book. So I popped out to my local bookstore and bought, I think it was the Dover edition mass market paperback, a very, very thick, all the collected works in 2 volumes of the small size paperbacks in tiny, tiny print that I don't know that I'd be able to actually read now. And just sat down and read my way straight through them in a way that, as I said, I hadn't since I was in school, which was a number of years before. And I found it fascinating because he was a character who had so much more dimension to him than I had expected. I mean, when you remember something that you read when you were a child, you kind of strip down all the complexity and you think of him as being, the thinking machine, right? Who just doesn't like people and bosses around people like his really only friend, Dr. Watson, and the long-suffering Mrs. Hudson. But when you open the stories as an adult, you discover a person who is much more complex than that, who has this passion for justice, who occasionally gives out unexpected glimpses of humor and whimsy. And I found them fascinating as a reader and ultimately as a writer, of how complicated the character was.
Well, that has to be one of the most unique journeys we've heard here. I mean, everybody's got their own unique story, obviously, but to hear how you approached Holmes in adulthood,
having already decided to steal him.
But
what's different there, of course, when you encounter the characters as an adult, is that your own tools and moral sense and values and understanding of people and thoughts about how the world works are just so much more complex than a much younger person, particularly someone who's encountering Holmes in the 5th grade or the 6th grade. But what echoed for you? Was it Holmes's sense of justice that you really resonated to?
Oh, I think partly, yeah. The fact that the cases that he works matter to him. They're not just intellectual puzzles. And I think so many people think of Holmes as being just somebody who's clever and who likes to figure out puzzles, but doesn't really care about the people involved. And that's not the character that I saw in those stories. I saw a character who is driven by the need for justice and setting things aright. But I also found, and I think the thing that made it possible to write the character for me going forward, these touches of humor that were quite unexpected. When poor Watson comes into the room and it's so filled with smoke, he has to fling open the window. And Holmes says, "Yes, I found that a concentrated atmosphere helps the mind to concentrate." And then goes on to say, "I haven't yet decided to get into a box to think," but that's such an absurd thing and so utterly unexpected, that sort of humor, that I thought, yeah, this is a character I could actually live with. I mean, not literally. I think we'd end up murdering Holmes in most of us, but but literarily, I could live with him.
So, talk to us a little bit about where this concept of Mary Russell came from. I mean, I know you kind of pinpointed the time when she would work with respect to Holmes, but maybe it was part of your writing journey beforehand, because you've written female characters before. Certainly, in some of your modern mystery series, the Kate Martinelli series. But talk a little bit about the evolution and birth of Mary Russell as a character.
Well, the only book I had written before The Beekeeper's Apprentice, I started some years before writing a book that was a sort of futuristic novel that was set in a time in the not too distant future when various catastrophes had come together to rob the world of most males. Which, sorry about this, guys, but I kill off all the men.
We understand.
Some of my best friends are men, but for the purposes of the story, I thought it was really interesting. And I got halfway into the story and realized I had no idea what I was doing with it, and so put it down because I was a young mother and I was very busy and I didn't really have time to spend on that. So when some years later I started writing again, I thought I would write something that had more structure to it, that is a mystery. Mysteries have a certain kind of story that you need to tell, and I found it a comfortable idea that it would guide me in putting a story together. Because when you're writing science fiction, they can go anywhere. Just absolutely. There's no structure involved at all. Whereas with the mystery, you have to tell the story in some logical fashion. So I had the idea of this young woman who has this extraordinary mind. And because it's always more interesting to put two similar but different things near each other so you can do a compare and contrast, I thought it was more interesting to have her actually work with Holmes rather than, for example, be a homicide detective with the San Francisco Police Department in the 1980s. And so that's where she and Holmes came together. And I started writing with The Beekeeper's Apprentice. I wrote a second one, which became the third in the series. And after that, when neither of them had sold, I decided to write a more contemporary series, and that's where Kate Martinelli came in. So the first book published was indeed a contemporary cop story, but it was, in fact, the third one that I actually wrote.
So you must have gotten your inspiration for mysteries by reading other mysteries, and you just told us you didn't really get into Sherlock Holmes until you began thinking about this. Well, so who are some of the other mystery writers or mystery titles that you were fond of?
Well, of course, this would have been the late 80s. I think I started The Beekeeper's Apprentice in 87, maybe. And so I was reading pretty much whoever was active at the time, Sue Grafton, obviously. But I read a lot of the Golden Age writers as well. Dorothy Sayers, Josephine Tey, Marjorie Allingham. And I think you can kind of feel those in the voice of Mary Russell. She is English American, but she writes very British. And I think that her overly precise and deliberate voice is very English rather than strictly American. And that probably comes from, especially Sayers and Josephine Tey. So, yeah, that's where she comes from. That's where the inspiration lies. And the fact that those Golden Age, particularly the women of the Golden Age of crime writing, had a way of focusing on the story, but allowing the personalities of the people to come in as well. Maybe not so much Agatha Christie. She is much more focused on the story itself. But the others, I think, the voices of the characters permeates all the story in a way that strict whodunits don't necessarily have. So,
was writing something you always thought you would get to or be? Are you one of those people who, as a kid, you were thinking up stories and reading voraciously? And
well, I did, but because I had never met a writer. Nowadays, I think a lot of kids are introduced to the idea of being a writer by having people come to their schools or, doing research into the authors they like or something like that. But I was an enormous reader, but it always felt to me like those books on the shelves had just sort of been placed there by God or something. And I couldn't imagine actual human beings having anything to do with them until I became a writer myself. So, no, I think I had never thought of being a writer until I started writing these things. I was in my 30s at the time. I'm not a very fast learner,
So what was the spark? I mean, there you are in your 30s, you've got a life established, you're on your way back from the market, and suddenly you say to yourself, I've got a pencil here.
Yeah, I do. It was probably an accumulation of things. My kids both were in school for the first time. My son was in preschool. I didn't have a full-time job. I didn't have a job because I was married to an academic, and people who have 10 weeks off over the summer tend to take off and do things over the summer, which people with normal jobs can't sort of tell their employer, by the way, I'm going to be gone all summer because we're going to India or England. So I didn't have a job. At some point I was going to have to get one when the kids got a little older. But I was home as a stay-at-home mom. I had three entire mornings a week on my own. I mean, it was a lot of free time. And I think that the Jeremy Brett series must have been on the television, the Granada TV Sherlock Holmes series, because Holmes was on my mind in a way that normally would not have been. Something must have planted it in my mind, and I think it must have been that. And it came together with this idea that Holmes gets credit for doing things that in a woman would be called female intuition and sort of dismissed because isn't that just guessing? And I think those various things came together with this idea of having someone who can actually get the better of Sherlock Holmes from time to time. So
that's really interesting. And has that sort of shaped? I mean, was Mary a character who sort of popped up to you fully formed, or because one of the things, in your latest book, the Publishers Weekly, I think, have commented on this and proposed some parallels between your life and Mary Russell's life. But is this a character who sort of was fully formed to you, or is she sort of evolved in a way that surprised you over time?
Her story has evolved, yeah, but I think it's amazing how her voice was there from the very beginning. That first sentence of "I was 15 when I first met Sherlock Holmes," that is exactly what I wrote the first day that I sat down to write her, and it is extremely rare and precious for a writer to have a character who just introduces themselves fully formed. And this was one of those rare occasions that Russell simply was there.
I like that. So you've got the two of them working together, Sherlock Holmes, who would have been in his 60s at this point, his early 60s.
I think when they meet, it's a very complicated set of chronology, and it's based on the Gloria Scott adventure and some other things that I worked out. But my Holmes is a bit younger than the traditional accepted age. So he's 57 when they first meet.
Oh, okay. And she's 15.
Yeah.
And eventually, over the course of the series, they become more than just working partners. They become romantic partners. That's not typically done with Sherlock Holmes. And, we saw William Gillette, of course, famously write to Conan Doyle, say, "May I marry Holmes," back in 1899. And Doyle gave his blessing, so it was okay.
Marry him or murder him. And I have to say, I can understand the urge to murder him occasionally. But so far I haven't. No.
Well, he's reaching his old age in the series, so natural causes and all that. But talk to us a little bit about that decision and the evolution of the relationship and how this all works.
Yeah, it is tricky. I fully acknowledge the fact that from the outside, it sounds really creepy that you have, this old guy who marries this young woman. And I fully understand people who are put off by the whole thing. If you'd said to me before I wrote them that this is what was going to happen, I would have said, "Oh, really?" But I mean, there's various things that are happening in the story. And for one thing, if they're going to be partners, it just felt odd to me to have them as working partners without opening the doors to an emotional connection as well. Because I think one of the things I wanted to do, and I didn't do it at first in the early ones, but eventually I wanted to allow this character of Sherlock Holmes to develop in ways that Arthur Conan Doyle either didn't or couldn't. Conan Doyle, and not just romantically, but as a person faced with a hugely changed society of post-World War I, Conan Doyle could never envision Holmes after the beginning of the Great War. And so the stories written afterwards were all set before, of course. I thought that was selling Holmes short. I thought that someone with that flexible, that supple and inquisitive a mind would not allow himself to be just ushered off the stage because Britain changed so hugely under the influences of the Great War. I thought that Sherlock Holmes as a person would grow and develop and move into the new world in ways that Conan Doyle couldn't envision. So that's kind of part of it. There's also the fact that in that period, such a huge percentage of the marriageable young men that would normally be, the fathers of the next generation, were just not there.
Yeah.
They were either dead in France or under the sea, or they were so disastrously injured that they were not husband material. So you had this generation of young women who had to either choose not to marry or to look outside their normal, possibilities. So you had a change in the kinds of marriages that took place in that period after the Great War. And the third thing that enters into that is the fact that I was married to a man 30 years older than I was. And I found his age less of a problem than the fact that he had been born and raised in India. And the fact that he was 30 years older than me really made little difference compared to the fact that he spent his childhood in a boys' school in the Himalayas, or he didn't learn to drive until he was an adult, and he had grown up around, cobras and rabid dogs, and the fact that he came from such a hugely different background. The age difference was a relatively minor consideration. So all these things that it seemed to be that the partnership between these two people would not be the kind of partnership you would normally see in any case. And I just allowed them to go ahead, and it seems to work. I don't get too many people saying that they're creeped out by the whole thing. So,
well, no, it certainly does seem to work. But, in that sort of environment, when you have someone coming from the other side of the moon, you've got these two very different cultures. A lot of different things can happen, but also, there's an element of intrigue. I mean, there's a lot of curiosity and trying to find common ground between this experience and that experience. Is that a factor in the relationship that you've observed developing between Holmes and Mary Russell? Does Holmes admire her?
Oh, I think he does, yes. I think he's often puzzled by her. The two of them often look at each other like, what planet are you from? But yeah, I think their minds are very similar, but their experiences and histories are different. And The new one, Lantern's Dance, has a background story of Holmes that one of the funny things about the character when you look at Sherlock Holmes from the point of view of a writer is that you have this immensely vivid and three-dimensional character. I mean, everyone in the world recognizes Sherlock Holmes. And yet Conan Doyle tells us almost nothing about him. He tells us we don't know anything about his backstory other than he has a brother, 7 years older, who is important in the government. He comes from a family of country squires in England, and that his grandmother was a sister of the artist Vernet, whichever artist Vernet you might choose to. And that he went to university, although it never says whether he actually graduated, which university it was, or what he was reading. So we know nothing else about this character that we all know. And so I found that so fascinating that you can write a character who's so filled with life and yet you know nothing about him. So the book that I've done now is to fill in a little bit of that backstory. Not, I think that the mystery is completely gone when you get there, but I thought you need to find out something about Holmes other than just his position in either the Conan Doyle stories or these books. So you have a son, and you have a background with Irene Adler, and you have this other representatives of the Vernet family and so forth. So, without giving away any spoilers,
Stick with us. We'll be back after this brief word from our sponsor. If you aren't yet signed up for email updates from MX Publishing, well, you're missing out. There are lots of freebies available for fans of MX Publishing that come out regularly. Every Friday, Steve MX sends out Thank Holmes It's Friday. And the latest one has top picks of 2023. If you use the code 2023 at checkout, you'll be able to get a discount on some of these titles. And if you sign up for the email updates, you'll also have access to audio codes for free audiobooks from MX Publishing. Titles like Sherlock Holmes, The Coronet Conspiracy by James Patrick Heatherly, The Selected Cases of Dr. Watson by Martin Daly, and Sherlock Holmes and the Adventure of the Bedeviled Foot by Thomas Kent Miller. Also, you'll be the first to know about new titles as they're released in 2024. Titles like The Devil at Prayers by Elora Lawthorne, Sherlock Holmes and the Barnyard Caper by Danielle Calloway, Sherlock Holmes Eliminate the Impossible by Paula Hammond, and Sherlock Holmes 5 Miles of Country by Gretchen Altebeff. Make sure you're signed up for email updates from our friends at MX Publishing. Just go to mxpublishing.com and register today. Yeah, it's fascinating that Holmes is still something of a blank canvas because there are so many gaps. I guess he's not quite a blank canvas. He's more of a framework, an architecture on which to build. And there's plenty to fill in there. So tell us about The Lantern's Dance, where we find ourselves, what's going on, and what readers who are interested in this series should expect.
It's always a conundrum with a series, especially once you start getting into the double digits of a series, how you keep it interesting. And one of the things that I did, because I didn't want to get bored myself, I started moving them around the world. And so from the very earliest books, in fact, Beekeeper's Apprentice has a section where they have to leave England for a time and they go off to what was then Palestine, Israel. So beginning with the very first book, they are traveling about the countryside. They're not just in Sussex or just in London. And by the time you get to Lantern's Dance, which is number 18, they have been to Morocco and Monaco and the Riviera, and they've been to Japan and to the United States, and basically, sort of all over the place. And they end up, the last book, they were in Romania, looking at a small problem with vampires with the Queen of Romania in Transylvania. And they now, Lantern's Dance opens when they are arriving at the house of the son that was introduced in a few books back, that Sherlock Holmes and Irene Adler had during the Great Hiatus. That Holmes did not know he had a son until the young man was in his 20s. So this is a reintroduction to that storyline that is extra canonical, but is in the Russell stories. And the mystery, this particular story begins when they get to the house and find that they have fled because there's some mysterious threat. And Holmes goes shooting off to look for his son and leaving Russell behind because she has a sore foot. And she finds a journal that she then has to decipher. And that's the sort of beginning of the whole book, is partly set in a village near Paris, and partly this journal that takes her back through the words of a young woman in India in the early part of the 19th century.
I mean, for anyone who's into that time period, in addition to that locale, it's a magical combination.
Mm.
And there's a long discussion in Holmesian scholarship about the influence of India on Sherlock Holmes. Where this came from, the fact that he has a Persian slipper, the fact that he meditates on a cushion, the fact that he likes curry, the fact that he studies Indian tobaccos. And as with all Holmesian scholarship, it's somewhat whimsical, but very solemn in a tongue-in-cheek sort of way. So this is in a way adding to that discussion of what is it with Holmes and India anyway?
What is it? What is it for you? About India and history. I mean, beyond your late husband, of course, but what have you? What about the culture and the experience and the history and the values and the sense of the world has been important to you?
Well, from the point of view of these books, of course, India made England as an empire. India fed into the British Empire in a way that none of the other colonies did. It established the identity of England in the world. Inevitably, there were sins committed, and England has much to answer for, and probably never will really establish itself as an innocent. But the history between India and England is essential to understand what the Victorian world was. And Holmes is Victorian, down to his bones. He is a Victorian gentleman. And without India in the background, none of that makes sense.
Yeah. And certainly when we think of, Watson's own evolution as a character, his first marriage, well, first that we know of, that is, was brought about particularly because of India, and what a strong flavor that played in The Sign of Four.
Well, I think just the fact that he and Holmes met was due to a Giselle bullet. Otherwise he wouldn't have been knocking around London looking for a cheap place to live, would he?
That's true. Very true. So, Laurie, as you've continued to write this series, and gosh, it's now been 30 years in publication. Happy anniversary, by the way.
Thank you.
What an extraordinary legacy you have here. But talk to us a little bit about the initial response you heard from Sherlockians, and maybe how you discovered that there even were Sherlockians, and because I know there is a very active and rabid group of Mary Russell fans out there. Talk to us a little bit about the fandom.
Yes, the fans. When I started this series, and as I said, I started writing it in the late 80s. It started being published in the early 90s. It was obviously before the internet was going. And so I was aware that there was Sherlockian scholarship because as an academic myself, I did research. And so I would, hunker down in the library and come up with collections of essays on Holmesian scholarship. The Dorothy Sayers and all kinds of essays on Sherlock Holmes. So I had met the idea of the game, of the Sherlockian studies early on. I don't know that I really then took the next step and thought about where it was now. Because, of course, a number of these were more classic collections rather than contemporary ones. And I didn't then go on to say, okay, so if people are still writing these, they must continue to be feeling passionate about these things. So I, kind of living in my own little corner of the world down in Watsonville, California, was quite insulated from anything even near to Sherlockian scions or the BSI. So that when I first published, the first Russell book was published, the first couple of them, there was the early days of the internet had a lot of, what were they? They weren't called chat groups, but they were like message boards. And one of the early ones was the Hounds of the Internet, which apparently just erupted in flames over the idea that I would write this young woman, pairing her with the great detective. And I suspect that they thought I was going to start writing romance. I mean, I think they would have been happy enough with just straight out Sherlockian erotica, but I think the one thing they couldn't, the idea that I would be writing Sherlock Holmes into romance was more than they would up with put. I lived on a farm in Watsonville, and these were the days when my modem was a little box that you plugged your phone into and you laid it onto, and it warbled. This is the dark ages when it comes to communication online. So I was completely unaware that the Sherlockian world was infuriated at the nerve of this king woman with her Mary Russell character. And it wasn't until years later that I discovered that people had really been upset over the whole thing. But by that time, I had already met people who were, active. Peter Blau I met early on, Les Klinger slightly later. But I think enough people looked at what I was doing with the stories and realized that I had a huge amount of respect, both for Sherlock Holmes and for Arthur Conan Doyle's work. And I think they were willing to extend, a bit of a leeway for me until it became obvious that I wasn't writing, girly romances. So I was forgiven. And then they eventually asked me to give a paper at the BSI dinner. And I delivered what I claim is the definitive paper on Watson's war wound, tackling the immortal question of he one place refers to it as being in his leg, and one place it's in his shoulder, and how can it be a bullet? And it's very simple in that these were Giselle bullets that were put together over campfires at night, melting scraps of metal, and they often tended to break in midair. And so therefore, there was a bullet and two wounds. So therefore, so the BSI was so impressed with this erudite scholarship that they asked me to become a member. And so I am now officially accepted into the otherwise predominantly manly breast of the Baker Street Irregulars as the Red Circle.
Well, a reference to the war wound, no doubt,
exactly.
Yeah, the Red Circle. But, to be fair to our listeners, we should say that your investiture in the Baker Street Irregulars, which I guess was what? It's like 15 years ago now, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. I think it was 2010. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's nothing compared to you won an Edgar, I think, for your first book, which was the Kate Martinelli book.
Right. A Grave Talent was the first one. It won the Edgar.
And you've won an Agatha and a Nero and a McCavity and a Lambda and the Creasy Memorial. You must have some mantle. And
I am a Grand Master.
Yes. Wow. Absolutely.
So there you go. So not only a BSI, but a Grand Master. There are not many of us in that club.
That's impressive. No. Yeah.
Wow. When the Watsonville, California Authors Society meets, there's probably a room for only your chair at the table.
It's not a really big table, no.
It's more like a small tray that you'd put up in front of the TV for dinner, probably.
Well, I live in Santa Cruz now, and it's a little bigger.
Oh, good.
There you go. So talk to us a little bit about the fans that you've seen come out of the woodwork thanks to this 30-year series that you're still writing for.
You meet the most interesting people who write you letters. At the very beginning, I started getting these lengthy typed letters from a woman I think she lived in Toronto. Fascinating letters, very, very erudite and, taking the whole matter terribly seriously. And I think that set the pattern for the fandom, is that they are an inquisitive lot. They are often very educated. They are full of good humor, madly energetic. I have 4 events planned during this year that are day-long celebrations of the Beekeeper's Apprentice. One of them in Santa Cruz. The other 3 will be connected with the 3 mystery conferences that take place left coast in Seattle, Malice Domestic in DC and Nashville, as we'll see BoucherCon. And in each of them, we're going to have speakers and projects, and fans are doing all kinds of fun things that we're going to be giving away. And I'm so looking forward to it. It's the sort of thing that you think, yeah, well, yes, it's promotion, but it's also a lot of fun. So, but those are. I'm really looking forward to seeing what the fans come up with at those.
Oh, you've found your fans, and they've found you. It's a wonderful combination.
Yeah.
Have you had any fans who, one of the things we were talking about a minute ago in the early days of the internet, before everyone discovered these communities, fan fiction was, tiny and isolated.
Yeah.
Are there fans who would like to take, how do I want to ask this? Are there fans who would like to take Mary Russell and Sherlock Holmes into avenues and directions that have not occurred to you?
There is a dedicated fan fiction site, yes, called Letters of Mary, which you can apply for admission, and she will allow you in. They trade stories, and yes, if you are asking about what they do behind closed doors, there are probably any number of those stories. I tend not to read them any more than I also don't tend to read Sherlockian pastiches, because I don't want to get other people's stories confused with my own. I am often asked to do blurbs for people who are writing Sherlockian stories, and I always have to say, I'm really sorry, I can't read them, because I don't want to think, oh yes, that was my story, I can write about X or Y, and then realize afterwards that no, it was something that snuck into my brain after reading someone else's. So I'm looking forward to retiring from writing Mary Russell, because then I can read everybody's stories. But until then, I have to put them on the back shelf and say, yeah, I can't read them yet.
Oh, good. What about collaborations? What about dramatizing the Laurie R. King canon? Has that been explored over the years? Do you have thoughts about that?
Oh yeah, I think we've talked to various people over the years, and we had one. If you're talking about movies and things, we had one production company that was very interested, and then unfortunately, COVID came, and everything just was up in the air, and it just didn't work out. So at some point, I'm sure, but it's because they are such different media, a book and something on a screen. I don't really have a lot of problem with the idea of something on a screen. You always hope that they're going to treat it with some respect and understanding, but they're so different. I think that it would be fun to see what other people do. I'm also talking to someone about doing a graphic novel adaptation of Beekeeper, which I think would be vast fun. So
it would be remarkable if one of your Mary Russell stories was brought to the screen and Millie Bobby Brown played Mary Russell. That would be.
There's getting kind of meta, isn't it?
That really is. That's absolutely. But some authors over the years, I'm sure you've read, I think it was P.D. James, who said at some point, I can't really think of Adam Dalgleish any longer without thinking of Roy Marsden, in my head. It would be interesting as, if they cast your character and the impact to you of that casting choice.
Yeah, it would be. And I know that, yes, a number of people who have had successful series have found that it's difficult for them to. Who is the Oxford?
Morse.
Detective, yeah. Yes, that John
Colin Dexter. Yeah.
Yes, Colin Dexter, and what was the actor's name?
John Thaw.
Thaw, thank you.
Yeah.
I keep thinking of him as Frost, but no, it's Thaw.
Jack Frost, that was his alter ego. Well, I mean, if you had your druthers, is there a particular actress you can think of who might be your ideal Mary Russell?
Oh, I think that, it's because she'd have to be young. It changes every few years because it would be difficult to find somebody. I remember a discussion, it must have been 15 years ago or so, a discussion with the production company that they were talking about Jodie Foster. And I said, Jodie Foster is my age. And they said, oh, yes, but she reads young. Okay.
Boy, there's a great compliment.
Yeah.
I thought, okay, they clearly haven't actually read the books.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, Jodie Foster would have been great, 50 years ago.
Yeah. I think back on one of those discussion boards decades ago, I recall somebody mentioning Amy Adams as a potential. Mm-hmm. I thought, well, that's interesting.
Yeah, I think that, as I say, every 5 years, whichever kind of vaguely physically correct young actress is there, people will say, "Oh, she'd be great." Sure. So, but
yeah. Well, I'm waiting for Angelina Jolie to play Miss Marple. After that, it'll be no holds barred for anything.
There we go. Right? Why not?
So, Laurie, what's next for you? What are you working on now?
I am doing the next Russell and Holmes. It'll be number 19 be out in 2025. It's got a character that was mentioned once in a short story, who is somebody that Russell hadn't seen since she was a child. Her father's younger brother, a ne'er-do-well and rogue named Uncle Jake. And this is Uncle Jake appears out of the mists and brings along a great deal of difficulty with him. So I think it's going to be a fun one. It's going to have a lot of humor in it. So
excellent. Well, that sounds good. Forget it, Jake. It's Mary Russell. Going all Chinatown on you now. Well, yeah. Laurie R. King, thank you so much for joining us here once again on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
We do hear of Sherlock everywhere, and I'm very glad to have been able to stop in and visit.
I'm always struck after these conversations about the richness of so many of the people that we talk to. And talking to Laurie, and you're talking to a thoughtful, creative, professional person, but how interesting that she was talking very early about the impact of those golden age stories, people like Dorothy Sayers in particular, and the voice of the characters and the richness of that literature. And it just calls to mind, the craft and profession. Conan Doyle dismissed his Sherlock Holmes stories at various times as being carpenter work, or this case or that case is carpenter work. Because for him it was easy, and he had figured out, a method and a formula for doing this that worked time after time. But here's Laurie, who's brought to the character the planning, the professionalism, the writing talent, the heart, the appreciation, the valuing. She's dealing with these characters, and they're cherished. She cherishes them in a way, and it's just so indicative of detective fiction and these kinds of stories at their very best.
Well, and I think that term "cherish" is exactly it. She takes such care, and there's such thoughtfulness. It's not just a caricature of Sherlock Holmes or a caricature of a young woman. She's deeply involved in these characters and in their evolution. And, I hadn't thought of it before, this coming to the Russell Holmes stories as a as a new person to the story, so as an outsider, seeing a 50-something marry, a late teenager, that does seem a little creepy. It obviously it happens or has happened over history quite a bit. But her description of it and the evolution of these two characters together, it makes a heck of a lot of sense. And her willingness to take Holmes from kind of a single or two-dimensional character and to really explore him. I was thinking during the interview of Charlie Chaplin's famous last marriage when he was 54, I think. He married Una O'Neill, who was only 18. And the great description there was that he said to her, "Marry me so I can teach you how to live and you can teach me how to die." And she said, "No, Charlie, I'm going to marry you so you can teach me how to grow up and I can teach you how to stay young." And I thought that, that very difference in what we might externally view as kind of a two-dimensional caricature of a May-December relationship versus what the characters, in this case with Holmes and Russell, or, with the Chaplins, there's a great deal of substance there. All right, it's time for everyone's favorite Sherlockian quiz show. That's right, it's time for Canonical Couplet, where we give you 2 lines of poetry, and we ask you to give us the Sherlock Holmes story that it is taken from. If you remember, around these parts, the last time we were here, we gave you this clue. When an old man's desire makes him climb a tree, Holmes thinks, "You can't make a monkey out of me." Bert, speaking of making monkeys, do you know which Sherlock Holmes story we are talking about?
Oh, come on. That's one of Holmes's famous espionage cases. It's about the German spy who hid secrets in belly button-sized candies. It's the case Watson called The Adventure of the Naval Sweetie.
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
Oh, painful. This is the painful predicament of Sherlock Holmes, I think William Gillette wrote about. No, unfortunately, that was not what we were looking for. We're going to turn to our friend Eric Deckers, who is always helpful. Yeah. And this is going to be a bit of a change-up for Eric. He said, "I searched and sought. I looked high and low. I read volumes of long-forgotten lore and spoke to sages. And as far as I could come up with, this is the adventure of words that don't have funny rhymes. Because this is the adventure of the blanched soldier." Oh, dear. Eric, I'm afraid you actually came up short this time. In doubly speaking, not only without your usual pun, but that is not the correct story.
Good grief.
This is off-brand for Eric. I'm worried about him, Bert. Should we send out a search party?
Well, I'm sure he'll be back. I mean, he's just off, slightly off trail. But then you and I are both slightly off trail.
We're completely off. Yeah, off our rockers. Yes. Well, no, Eric, the answer we were looking for this time around is the creeping man. The creeping man, hence the monkey there. That was the clue. But the good news is we had a number of other people who also submitted their answers, their correct answers. So we're going to bring in the big prize wheel and give it a spin. Watching it go around, landing on number 24. And that looks like it is, Jim Purcell.
Yay!
Jim from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Congratulations to you, Jim. And I should note that last summer, Jim wrote into us, Bert, to make a surprising admission. Speaking of people who may be a little off-kilter, he said, I just wanted to mention that I recently finished binge listening to all 267 episodes of iHos. I did a couple a day to make work a bit more bearable. The show's very enjoyable. Bert's sense of humor is always good for a laugh, but I learned a lot. Thank you for your efforts.
That's so nice. Normally when we get notes from people who say they've listened to the entire iHos canon, it's usually accompanied by a subpoena. And this is really refreshing, not to have
a medical
legal
bill from the
action.
people that pass out from having fallen asleep while walking, listening to us.
Yes.
It's a dangerous game we set ourselves up in. Well, Jim, the good news is we have a little tchotchke for you, a little something from the iHos vaults. I'm thinking, I wonder if we had scared something up from the BSI weekend or not, but either way, we'll have something headed your way fairly soon, so stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, the rest of you get to work, get your pencils out, and get ready, because here is this episode's canonical couplet clue. A Christmas Tale, one of the best produced, left the sad culprit permanently goosed. If you know the answer to this episode's canonical couplet, put it in an email addressed to comment@ihearofsherlock.com with canonical couplet in the subject line. If you're among all of the correct answers and we choose you at random, you'll win. Good luck. And we will have a copy of Laurie R. King's new book available for you. So you'll want to get right on that. Well, Bert, you know what time it is?
Yeah, it's 4:15, I think.
No. It's time for the news.
Hooray!
News, sports, weather, and traffic on the threes here on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. No, it's all the Sherlockian news that we feel is appropriate. You want to lead us off?
The news. Well, the Sherlock Holmes Society of London is planning their next excursion. They're off to India in 2025 from February 22nd to March 9th, 2025. And we will have in the show notes a link to their downloadable and colorful brochure. And now is the time to be thinking seriously about joining them and expressing your interest in all of that information you could find at the link.
Now, that could be fascinating. We know the Sherlock Holmes Society of London does these excursions every few years. They've gone to Switzerland a number of times. Do you know where else they've gone? Yeah, I think you have the full history.
Well, they've been, lots of places in the UK. They've had great jaunts to different parts of the country with canonical themed weekends and events. But on the continent, I don't recall where else they've been. Other
Switzerland's really the big one, because they repeat that every so often. I don't know if it's every decade or so, but and it's usually an all-out effort. People are in full costume, and there's obviously stops along the way. It's really something to behold. And the write-ups afterward are lovely. Obviously, papers are given along the way as well. So this trip to India should be another memorable one. It'd be interesting to see if you'll have the opportunity to have your legs snapped off by a crocodile in the Ganges. That's part of the Jonathan Small side excursion, I think. Okay, we also have manuscript news. It's always interesting to see when a Sherlock Holmes manuscript goes up for auction. And last year, Sotheby's auctioned off 4 pages of the manuscript of The Crooked Man. That's all that was known to survive of that manuscript. And I believe the auction went for over $95,000 for those 4 pages last July. And it looks like whoever bought that is of an enterprising bent, because now one of the 4 pages is being sent to auction at RR Auction in Amherst, New Hampshire. Auction's taking place on February 22nd, and the estimate for that single page is $40,000. Oh, that's maybe this is a new business people are going into, manuscript flipping, like house flipping. So you can read about that page, what's on it. I believe it is the page that has elementary on it, if I'm not mistaken. That phrase where it's not elementary, my dear Watson, but it just says elementary. You can check that out at Randall Stock's Best of Sherlock website.
One of the interesting things, and I always pronounce, I think, his name wrong, but it is, it's basically...
Hayao Miyazaki? Oh,
Yeah,
no, Hayao Miyazaki.
Hayao Miyazaki, right.
Hayao
But it's anime's 40th
Miyazaki.
anniversary. And in that honor, Hayao Miyazaki's animated series Sherlock Holmes is returning to Japanese theaters in fully remastered HD. And this was originally broadcast on TV. And Sherlock Holmes adapted the characters. Sherlock Holmes adapted these characters for a younger audience as canines. And now the series is getting a limited theatrical run in 2024 from March 22nd to April 18th. So their digitally remastered versions of the 2 compilation films will be screened at different venues across Japan. But these are also available in the States, although I don't remember exactly where. I know they were released in late 2022 in Blu-ray in the United States, and that version included both the English track and the original Japanese language track. But it's a wonderful feature, and it goes back to the 1980s. It was released originally in November of 1986. And so for those people who are fascinated by anime, this is a great opportunity, particularly if you're in Japan, to see this remarkable Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah, it looks like it's going to be screened at some 117 theaters throughout Japan. And tickets cost 1,600 yen for adults and 1,000 yen for children. That's about $10.88 US dollars and $6.80.
It's a bargain.
So that's a good deal. That's a good deal. And for those of you, the 1980s, wonderful time to be a Sherlock Holmes fan. Of course, you had the Jeremy Brett Granada series that was seemingly everywhere. But you also had Basil of Baker Street making its way to the animated screen, thanks to Disney. And I believe in the late 80s, early 90s, the character Wishbone on public television in the United States made an appearance as Sherlock Holmes as well. So this notion of animation and animals playing their part in Sherlock Holmes is a fun one. Okay, closing up the news bag. Always a good thing. So, Bert.
Yes.
And any plans between now and Valentine's Day?
Between now and Valentine's Day. I expect these 2 weeks will be filled with me cutting out my little Valentine Day cards and driving around the neighborhood and putting them in the mailboxes of all of my friends who I hope remember me. And then, sadly, I'll have my usual Charlie Brown experience sitting next to my empty mailbox with only bills from the power company and that usual sad look from the postman or postperson who realizes that, again, I've been disappointed as I am annually. And that's what I dislike most. You know, the pity. The pity, postal pity, is probably the worst kind of pity.
Postal pity. Well, you know what? Here's one for our listeners. We want to celebrate Valentine's Day, too, and we will have a series of Sherlockian Valentines courtesy of James O'Leary. And James has the investiture in the Baker Street Irregular, James, the son of the Grimpen postmaster, because he works in the Postal Service. So he brainstormed and came up with some Sherlockian Valentines. You want to make sure you get to our website, ihearofsherlock.com, and make sure you're signed up for updates there. And we'll have them available to our Patreon supporters as well. We'll automatically shoot those out to you. So check that out. And Bert, I should mention that this is the time of the year when I have my annual rereading in honor of Valentine's Day of the Bruce Partington plans.
Oh.
Very important to connect that with Valentine's Day.
Yes.
Absolutely. Do you know why?
Yes, because of the name of the evildoer.
Who?
Valentine Walter.
Oh, was that it? I thought it's because my love interests are always befogged. And my jokes are clearly underwater. Yeah. No, Colonel Valentine Walter. That's our connection to Valentine's Day. Well done. You're much better here than you are during the quiz, I must say. Why can't you bring that Bert to Canonical Couplets?
I knew I was better somewhere, you know.
Well, this is the always improving Scott Monty.
And I'm just the consistently average Bert Wolder.
And together, we say, the game's afoot.
Afoot.
The game's afoot.
You know, I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I'm neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.